Have you ever noticed how strange it feels when someone understands something about you a little too quickly? Maybe it's a struggle you've been carrying for years. Maybe it's a decision you spent months trying to make sense of. Maybe it's something you've replayed in your head so many times. You can barely imagine anyone else seeing it the same way. And then somebody looks at it for 5 minutes and says, "I think I understand." You would think that would feel relieving, and sometimes it does. But sometimes the reaction is surprisingly different. Sometimes you immediately want to explain more, correct them, add context, push back, almost as if their understanding has missed something important. And maybe it has. But that's not always what makes people uncomfortable. Because sometimes what makes us uncomfortable isn't being misunderstood. It's the possibility that someone has understood something. We're still trying to understand ourselves. Most people think they want to be understood, and sometimes they do. But very often, what feels good isn't understanding. It's agreement. Agreement is simple. Agreement says, "That makes sense. I would have done the same thing. You're not wrong for feeling that way." And there is nothing wrong with wanting that, because agreement does something important. It reassures us. It tells us we're not alone in our perspective, that the way we've made sense of something isn't completely unreasonable. Most of us spend a surprising amount of time looking for that feeling. Not because we're dishonest, not because we're insecure, but because life is complicated. And when somebody sees things the way we see them, even for a moment, it creates a sense of relief. The conversation feels easy, comfortable, predictable. There is no friction, no need to explain further, no need to defend anything. Everything fits neatly into place. And because that feeling is so satisfying, it's easy to mistake it for understanding. But the two are not always the same thing. The difference usually appears so quietly that most people don't notice it. Because agreement and understanding often sound similar in the beginning. Both involve listening. Both involve empathy. Both make us feel heard. But after a certain point, they start moving in different directions. Agreement stays close to our version of events. Understanding doesn't always. Sometimes understanding asks a question we weren't expecting. Sometimes it notices a contradiction we've learned to ignore. Sometimes it focuses on a detail we thought was unimportant. And sometimes it reaches a conclusion we weren't planning to reach ourselves. That's usually where the discomfort begins. Not because the other person is attacking us, and not because they're necessarily wrong, but because for the first time, the conversation is no longer happening entirely on our terms. The perspective we've been carrying suddenly has company. Another interpretation enters the room, another possibility, another way of understanding the same experience. And whether we realize it or not, that changes something. Because agreement makes us feel certain. Understanding can feel strangely exposing, as if something that existed entirely inside your own head suddenly has another witness. If any part of this feels quietly familiar, that's probably because these are experiences most people have, but rarely put into words. This channel is for those kinds of conversations. So if these essays help you make sense of something you've been carrying, stay a while. The discomfort doesn't always come from being understood. At least not entirely. It comes from everything we've invested into our own understanding. Because by the time someone else steps into an experience, we've usually been living with it for a while, thinking about it, replaying it, trying to make sense of it, trying to decide what it means. And over time, our interpretation becomes part of the experience itself, simply because it's the version we've been living with, the version we've carried, the version we've used to make sense of what happened. So when someone offers a different perspective, the reaction is rarely, "That's interesting." It's often, "No, it's more complicated than that." And sometimes it is. But sometimes what makes us uncomfortable is realizing that another person can stand in the same experience and see something we hadn't considered. Maybe that's why being understood feels so different from what we expect, because we often imagine understanding as a form of validation, a moment where someone finally confirms what we've been feeling all along. But real understanding doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it widens the conversation. Sometimes it introduces a possibility we hadn't considered before, and that can feel uncomfortable. Not because understanding has failed, but because we're being asked to hold more than one interpretation at once, the one we've lived with and the one we're only beginning to consider. The discomfort isn't always a sign that somebody got it wrong. Sometimes it's the feeling of encountering a perspective that doesn't quite match the one we've been carrying. And maybe that's the value of being understood in the first place. Not that another person sees exactly what we see, but that they help us see more than we could see alone. Maybe that's why being understood is so much rarer than we think. Not because people don't care, but because real understanding asks something of both people. It asks one person to speak honestly, and it asks the other to listen, without immediately turning the experience into their own. Neither of those things are easy, and maybe that's why the next time somebody offers a perspective that makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to rush to accept it, but you don't have to reject it either. You can simply let it sit there for a while, beside the version you've been carrying, because understanding was never meant to replace your experience. It was never meant to take ownership of it. It was only meant to add another way of looking at it. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the people who try to understand us won't get everything right. They'll miss details, misread parts of the story, reach conclusions we don't agree with. But the effort still matters. Because in a world where most people are busy carrying their own struggles, being genuinely understood is a rare thing. Not agreement, not validation, understanding. And maybe the goal was never to find people who see everything exactly the way we do. Maybe it's to remain open to the possibility that there is more than one way to understand the same experience. And sometimes, that's where understanding begins. I'll see you in the quiet.